The viewing gallery fell silent the moment Ari Brennan pushed off the docking rail and cartwheeled through 300 meters of open void. No tether, no propulsion pack, just the memory of childhood trampolines and a reckless grin behind her visor. The Talvari flight instructor froze mid-sentence, his slate clattering to the deck, while every cadet in the observation dome pressed closer to the glass. Nobody moved like that in zero-G, nobody should. Ari had arrived at Helix Station 3 weeks earlier with a duffel bag, a sponsorship letter from the Joint Terrestrial Defense Initiative, and absolutely no idea how to use a maglock properly. The intake coordinator, a beetle-browed Virin named Korik, had watched her stumble off the shuttle ramp, collide with a cargo loader, and ricochet into a support strut before catching herself on a hanging cable. He tapped something into his wrist display and muttered a phrase in Virinic that the translator rendered as gravity's orphan. She'd heard worse. Back in Portland, her high school guidance counselor had called her application to the Interstellar Cadet Exchange Program ambitious in a tone that meant delusional. Her mom had just hugged her at the airport and said, "Don't let them convince you you're small." Helix Station was a joint venture, part military academy, part cultural experiment. Humans were the newest addition to the Galactic Cooperative Defense Network, and the species who'd been flying starships for millennia wanted to see if Earth's pilots could keep up. Most of the cadets were Talvari, sleek reptilian beings with triple-jointed limbs and inner eyelids that never blinked during high-speed maneuvers. A few cross-crystalline entities who navigated by magnetic resonance floated in specialized pods near the practice bays. There were two other humans, Marcus Chen, a former Air Force test pilot who moved through the station like he'd been born there, and Yuki Tanaka, a robotics engineer who spent most of her time in the lab modules and rarely spoke. Ari's first week had been a parade of humiliations. She'd vomited twice during orientation spins, missed every handhold in the main corridor, and accidentally launched herself into the commissary ceiling during a routine airlock drill. The Talvari cadets had started calling her Thrumka, the word for a hatchling that hadn't learned to glide yet. But Ari had spent her childhood in gymnastics studios and parkour gyms, learning to read her body in motion. She knew how to flip, how to redirect momentum, how to make herself small or wide depending on the need. Gravity had always been her anchor. Without it, she'd felt unmoored at first, but then she'd started to notice patterns. The way a spin could become a pivot. The way a push could carry you farther if you angled your shoulders just right. The way zero-G wasn't chaos, it was just a different kind of dance. On her 16th day aboard Helix, she'd stayed late in the practice module after evening drills. The bay was empty except for the hum of life support and the distant clang of maintenance bots. She'd floated to the center of the chamber, closed her eyes, and let herself spin. 1 rotation, 2, 3. She tucked her knees, extended her arms, and felt the station's rotation press against her like a gentle hand. When she opened her eyes, she was upside down relative to the observation window, but her body knew exactly where she was. She'd laughed, a bright, reckless sound that echoed off the bulkheads, and launched herself toward the nearest wall, rebounding in a controlled arc that sent her spiraling through the practice rings suspended in the module's center. She threaded the first ring, twisted through the second, and caught the third with her fingertips, using the momentum to flip herself into a perfect pike position before spreading her limbs to slow her spin. It felt like flying. The next morning, flight instructor Dersh, a Talvari veteran with silver scales and a voice like grinding gears, had announced a formation drill. Cadets would navigate a series of checkpoints in the outer ring using standard propulsion packs. Ari had strapped into her gear along with the others, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the thrust controls. The Talvari moved through the course like quicksilver, their movements precise and economical. Marcus completed it in 4 minutes flat. Ari had gotten tangled in her own propulsion line and drifted off course twice before finally reaching the finish marker. Dersh had marked her score with a single syllable, inadequate. But that night, alone in the practice bay again, Ari had unstrapped the propulsion pack and tried the course without it. She'd used the handholds, the wall panels, even the ventilation grills to redirect herself. She'd pushed off with her legs, pulled with her arms, and let her body remember the rhythm of movement. She'd finished the course in 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Nobody had been there to see it, but she'd felt something shift inside her, a quiet certainty that she wasn't broken. She was just learning a new language. The breakthrough came during a surprise simulation 2 days later. The alarm had woken them at 400 station time, a shrill, pulsing klaxon that sent cadets scrambling from their sleep pods. Ari had tumbled out of her bunk, still half dreaming, and collided with Yuki in the corridor. "Emergency drill," Yuki had said, her voice tight. "Hostile intercept scenario." They'd suited up in the ready room, the Talvari cadets moving with practiced efficiency while Ari fumbled with her helmet seals. Dersh had appeared on the main screen, his scaled face impassive. "Hostiles have breached the outer defense perimeter," he'd announced. "Your objective, retrieve supply canisters from the drift field and return them to the station before the enemy reaches firing range. You have 12 minutes. The drift field was a nightmare, a cloud of tumbling canisters released into open space, each one spinning on a different axis. The cadets had to navigate the field, grab as many canisters as possible, and return to the docking bay before the timer ran out. It was a test of speed, spatial reasoning, and propulsion control. It was also, Ari realized as she watched the Talvari launch themselves into the void, a test designed for species who'd been flying since before humans had invented the wheel. She'd hung back at the docking rail, watching the others dart through the field like silver fish. They used short, controlled bursts from their propulsion packs, angling themselves to match the spin of each canister before snagging it with magnetic clamps. It was efficient. It was elegant. It was also slow. Ari had looked at the drift field and seen something different. The canisters weren't random, they were following predictable arcs, each one influenced by the station's rotation and the slight gravitational pull of Helix's core. If she could predict the pattern, she could move through the field without stopping. She could flow. She'd pushed off the rail without activating her propulsion pack. The first few seconds had been terrifying, a blind leap into open space with nothing but her own momentum to carry her. But then her body had remembered. She'd tucked into a spin, extended her arms to adjust her trajectory, and caught the first canister as it tumbled past. The impact had sent her into a slow roll, but she'd used it, pushing off the canister to redirect herself toward the next one. She'd threaded through the field like a needle through fabric, grabbing canisters and using their mass to slingshot herself forward. She'd heard Dersh's voice crackle through the comms. "Cadet Brennan, you are off protocol. Activate your propulsion system immediately." She'd ignored him. There wasn't time to argue. She'd spotted a cluster of 3 canisters tumbling in formation and launched herself toward them, spinning to match their rotation. She'd grabbed one, pushed off it to catch the second, and used the combined momentum to swing herself toward the third. Her magnetic clamps had locked onto all 3 at once, and she'd kicked off the nearest bulkhead to redirect herself back toward the docking bay. By the time she'd returned, 6 other cadets were still in the field. She'd clipped her canisters to the collection net, turned, and pushed off again, this time aiming for a canister that was drifting toward the outer edge of the field. She'd caught it mid-spin, used it to pivot, and launched herself back toward the station in a perfect arc. The timer had hit 0 just as she'd clipped her final canister to the net. She'd floated there, breathing hard, her visor fogged with condensation. The docking bay had been silent. Then Marcus had started clapping, a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed through the comms. Yuki had joined in. Even one of the Talvari cadets, a young male named Sirik, had tapped his claws against his helmet in what Ari had learned was a gesture of respect. Dersh had pulled her aside after the debriefing. His face had been unreadable, but his voice had carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "You retrieved 11 canisters in 12 minutes, he'd said. "Without propulsion, explain." Ari had shrugged, still catching her breath. I followed the pattern. The canisters were moving in arcs, so I matched the arcs, like catching a ball or a trapeze." Dersh had stared at her for a long moment. Then he tapped something into his slate and said, "Report to advanced maneuvers at 600 tomorrow." "Do not be late." That night, Sirik had approached her in the commissary. He'd set down a tray of nutrient paste and sat across from her, his tail curling around the bench. "They say humans are clumsy in 0G, he'd said. "They say you are handicapped by your biology." Ari had poked at her food. "Yeah, I've heard." Sirik had leaned forward, his inner eyelids flickering. "I do not think that is true. I think humans are simply new, and the new sometimes see what the old have forgotten." Ari had looked up, surprised. Sirik's expression was serious, almost solemn. "What did the old forget?" she'd asked. "That space is not a place to conquer," Sirik had said. "It is a place to dance." Advanced maneuvers turned out to be less of a class and more of a gauntlet. Dersh had assigned Ari to a mixed squad with 4 Talvari cadets and 1 cross named Loom, whose crystalline body refracted light in strange, hypnotic patterns. Their first mission: navigate a debris field in full combat simulation while under simulated enemy fire. The Talvari had approached it like a military exercise: precise formations, synchronized movements, constant communication. Ari had tried to follow their lead at first, but the rigid structure felt wrong. She kept drifting out of position, her instincts pulling her toward gaps in the debris that the others were avoiding. Halfway through the exercise, the simulation had thrown them a curveball, a sudden cascade failure that sent debris tumbling in unpredictable directions. The Talvari had frozen, recalibrating their routes. Ari had spotted a narrow corridor through the chaos, a twisting path that required constant adjustment but would cut their time in half. She'd called it out over comms. "I can thread it, follow my line." One of the Talvari, a female named Keshra, had snapped back, "That route is suicide. Stay in formation." But Ari had already launched herself into the corridor, her body twisting through the debris like water through a sieve. She'd used every surface, every spinning fragment to redirect herself. She caught a tumbling hull plate and used it as a shield, letting it absorb a simulated weapons hit while she pivoted behind it. She'd threaded through a gap barely wider than her shoulders, spun to avoid a jagged spar, and emerged on the other side of the field in under 2 minutes. The rest of the squad had taken 5. Keshra had confronted her in the debriefing room, her scales flushed with frustration. "You broke formation," she'd hissed. "You ignored orders. She completed the objective," Dersh had interrupted, his voice flat. "Efficiently, effectively, that is what matters in combat." Keshra had fallen silent, but her glare could have melted hull plating. Over the next 2 weeks, Ari had continued to push boundaries. She'd started experimenting with moves that shouldn't have worked, barrel rolls that turned into spirals, rebounds off walls that launched her into controlled tumbles. She'd stopped using her propulsion pack entirely during drills, relying instead on her body and the environment. It was faster, it was quieter, and it drove the Talvari instructors absolutely insane, but it also started to catch attention. Cadets from other squads began showing up to watch her practice sessions. Loom the Cross had approached her after one particularly wild maneuver and pulsed a message through their translator. "You move like a photon, unpredictable but coherent." Marcus had been less poetic. "You're making the rest of us look bad," he'd said with a grin. "Keep it up." Yuki had started documenting Ari's movements, recording her spins and arcs and analyzing the physics. "You're using rotational inertia in ways the propulsion systems can't replicate," she'd said one evening, pulling up a holographic model of Ari's latest maneuver. "It's like you're turning yourself into a gyroscope. That's actually genius." Ari had shrugged, embarrassed. "It just feels right." The real test came during the monthly inter-squad competition, a live exercise where squads competed to retrieve a damaged ship from a simulated battlefield while under fire from automated drones. The winning squad got priority access to the station's rec facilities for a month. More importantly, they got bragging rights. Ari's squad, callsign Helix 7, had drawn one of the hardest scenarios: a ship drifting in a dense asteroid cluster with limited visibility and constant drone patrols. Keshra had taken point, directing the squad into a tight diamond formation. Ari had followed at first, but as they entered the cluster, she'd spotted something the others had missed: a thermal vent on one of the larger asteroids, its exhaust creating a predictable current that could carry them straight to the ship. She'd broken formation without asking. Keshra's voice had exploded in her helmet. Brennan returned to position immediately, but Ari had already caught the current, tucking into a spin that let the vent's exhaust propel her forward. She'd used the asteroids as anchors, bouncing between them in a zigzag pattern that kept her out of the drone's targeting arcs. She'd reached the ship in under 3 minutes, clipped a magnetic tow line to its hull, and started pulling it back toward the extraction point. The rest of the squad had arrived 2 minutes later, furious and breathless, but the mission clock showed Helix 7 in first place. They'd held onto that lead all the way to the finish line. The victory should have been celebrated. Instead, it became a flashpoint. Keshra had filed a formal complaint with the Academy Board, accusing Ari of reckless endangerment and insubordination. The complaint had triggered a hearing, a public one, held in the station's main assembly hall with every cadet and instructor in attendance. Ari had sat in the defendant's chair, her stomach churning, while Keshra laid out her case. Human Cadet Brennan repeatedly disregards protocol, Keshra had said, her voice sharp. She operates without coordination, without communication, and without regard for her squadmates. She is a liability. Daresh had been called as a witness. He'd stood at the podium, his scaled hands resting on the surface, and spoken in measured tones. Cadet Brennan's methods are unconventional, but they are effective. Her completion times exceed Academy averages by 32%. Her error rate is negligible. And she has never caused harm to another cadet. Keshra had cut in. Effectiveness is not the only measure of a pilot. Discipline matters, trust matters. How can we trust someone who refuses to follow orders? Ari had felt the weight of every gaze in the room. She'd wanted to shrink, to disappear, but then she'd remembered her mother's words at the airport, "Don't let them convince you you're small." She'd stood up. Permission to speak? The presiding officer, a Talvari elder named Vorik, had nodded. Ari had taken a breath. "I don't follow orders blindly because I don't think that's what good pilots do. I follow the mission. I adapt. I look for solutions that the manual doesn't cover. And yeah, sometimes that means breaking formation, but it also means I get the job done." Keshra had scoffed. "You get lucky?" "No," Ari had said, her voice steady. "I get creative, and if you can't tell the difference, maybe you're the one who's limited." The room had gone silent. Vorik had leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Bold words, "Cadet Brennan, can you prove them?" Ari had met his gaze. "How? A duel," Keshra had said, rising from her seat. "Single combat simulation, no squad, no backup, just you and me in the training field. If you win, I withdraw my complaint. If I win, you resign from the program." Ari's heart had hammered against her ribs, but she'd nodded. Deal. The duel had been scheduled for the following evening. The training field was a massive sphere filled with obstacles, drifting cargo containers, broken hull sections, magnetic anomalies. The objective was simple: tag your opponent with a tracking beacon before they tagged you. First hit one. Ari had spent the day preparing, running through maneuvers in her head, visualizing every possible angle. Yuki had helped her map the field's layout, identifying choke points and potential ambush zones. Marcus had offered tactical advice, but Ari had shaken her head. "I'm not going to out-tactic her. I'm going to outmove her." When the duel began, Keshra had launched herself into the field with military precision, using her propulsion pack to accelerate toward the center. Ari had gone the opposite direction, toward the edge, where the obstacles were denser. She'd slipped between two cargo containers, pushed off a broken spar, and used a magnetic panel to slingshot herself into a tight spiral. Keshra had tracked her movement, firing her beacon in a calculated arc. Ari had twisted mid-flight, letting the beacon pass centimeters from her shoulder. She caught a handhold, redirected, and launched herself toward Keshra in a corkscrew dive. Keshra had adjusted, activating a burst from her propulsion pack to dodge, but Ari had anticipated it. She'd pushed off a nearby container at the last second, flipping herself into a spin that brought her face-to-face with Keshra from an impossible angle. She'd fired her beacon point-blank. The impact had registered on Keshra's suit, and the simulation had ended with a sharp chime. Ari had floated there, breathing hard, while the entire station watched through the observation dome. Keshra had removed her helmet, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she'd extended a clawed hand. "I was wrong," Keshra had said. "You are not reckless. You are exceptional." Ari had taken her hand, relief flooding through her. "Thanks, but I'm still figuring it out." Keshra had smiled, a rare expression for a Talvari. "Then perhaps we all are." The crowd in the observation dome had erupted in cheers, human, Talvari, and cross voices blending into a single roar of approval. In the weeks that followed, something shifted on Helix Station. Ari's unorthodox methods became the subject of study rather than scorn. Instructors started incorporating freeform maneuvers into the curriculum, and cadets from every species began experimenting with movement beyond their propulsion packs. Sirik had been the first to try, mimicking Ari's spiral technique during a formation drill. He'd crashed into a bulkhead on his first attempt, but on his second, he'd threaded through a gap that should have been impossible for his larger frame. Even Keshra had started to loosen up, trading rigid formations for adaptive tactics that allowed her squad to respond to chaos instead of trying to control it. Ari had become something of a reluctant mentor. Cadets sought her out in the practice bays, asking her to demonstrate spins or rebounds. She'd shown them what she could, but she'd always emphasized the same thing. It's not about copying me, it's about finding what works for your body. Space doesn't care what species you are, it just cares if you can move with it. Yuki had compiled Ari's techniques into a training module complete with physics breakdowns and video demonstrations. Dersh had approved it for integration into the Academy's official curriculum. "This is unprecedented," he'd told Ari during a private meeting. "You have changed how we teach, that is no small thing." Ari had felt a swell of pride, but also a strange weight. "I didn't mean to change anything, I just wanted to survive." Dersh had nodded. "And in surviving, you have taught us all to see differently. That is the mark of a true pilot." The final exam had come at the end of the term, a fleet-wide simulation where every squad would face a coordinated enemy assault on Helix Station. It was the most complex scenario the Academy had ever run, designed to test every skill the cadets had learned. Ari's squad, Helix 7, had been assigned to defend the station's central docking bay, a critical choke point that would determine the outcome of the battle. The enemy forces had come in waves, each one more aggressive than the last. Helix 7 had held the line, using a mix of traditional tactics and the adaptive maneuvers Ari had taught them. Keshra had commanded the defense, but she deferred to Ari during the critical moments when the formation broke down and chaos took over. In the final wave, a massive enemy cruiser had breached the outer perimeter, launching a barrage of drone fighters toward the docking bay. Helix 7 had been outnumbered 3-1. Keshra had called for a tactical retreat, but Ari had spotted an opening, a weak point in the cruiser's formation where the drones were clustered too tightly. She'd launched herself into the swarm without a word, her body spinning through the gaps like a dancer in a storm. She tagged drones with disabling charges, using their explosions to propel herself deeper into the formation. She'd reached the cruiser's command node, planted a simulation charge, and kicked off just as it detonated. The cruiser had gone dark and the drone swarm had collapsed. Helix Station had held. When the simulation ended, the entire fleet had gone silent. Then, slowly, the applause had started, not just from the cadets but from the instructors, the command staff, and even the off-duty pilots watching from the crew decks. Ari had floated in the docking bay, exhausted and exhilarated, while her squadmates surrounded her. Keshra had clasped her shoulder. "You saved us all," she'd said, "and you made it look easy." Ari had laughed, her voice breathless. "It wasn't easy, but it was fun." That night, the Academy had held a celebration in the main hall. There had been food, music, and speeches. Vorik had presented Ari with a commendation medal, a rare honor for a first-year cadet. But the moment that had mattered most had come later, when Sirik had approached her with a small, carved stone. "This is a Kethra," he'd said, "a gravity stone. My people give them to those who have taught us to see the world anew. You have taught me that space is not a battlefield, it is a playground." Ari had taken the stone, its weight solid and warm in her palm. "Thank you," she'd said, her throat tight. "That means more than you know." 3 months later, Ari had stood on the observation deck, watching a new cohort of cadets arrive at Helix Station. They'd stumbled off the shuttle ramps, collided with cargo loaders, and drifted into support struts, just like she had. But this time, the instructors hadn't looked at them with disdain. They'd looked at them with curiosity. Because now, everyone knew the ones who struggled with zero-G weren't broken. They were just learning a new language, and sometimes the ones who learned last taught the best lessons. Ari had smiled, touching the Kethra in her pocket, and pushed off the rail into a lazy spin. The station turned around her, vast and strange and beautiful. Somewhere below, a young cadet was learning to fly.